Good evening, I'm Amna Nawaz.
And I'm Jeff Bennett. On the NewsHour tonight.
When the middle class is strong, America is strong.
Kamala Harris outlines her economic plan, including child tax credits, housing incentives, and a ban on price gouging on groceries.
Negotiators for a Gaza ceasefire deal make significant progress, but sticking points remain.
And amid a horrific civil war in Sudan, that country's vice president defends his unwillingness to participate in U.S.-led peace talks.
Major funding for the PBS NewsHour has been provided by the ongoing support of these individuals and institutions, and friends of the NewsHour, including Jim and Nancy Bildner, and the Robert and Virginia Schiller Foundation, the Judy and Peter Bloom Kovler Foundation, upholding freedom by strengthening democracies at home and abroad.
The John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, fostering informed and engaged communities. More at kf.org.
And with the ongoing support of these individuals and institutions. And friends of the NewsHour. This program was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
Welcome to the NewsHour. It was her first major policy speech since becoming the Democratic presidential candidate last month.
This afternoon, Vice President Kamala Harris laid out her vision for combating one of the biggest issues for voters in this year's election, and one that has dogged the Biden-Harris administration: rising prices. Today, Vice President Harris on the trail in North Carolina as her campaign unveils its economic agenda.
Costs are still too high. And on a deeper level, for too many people, no matter how much they work, it feels so hard to just be able to get ahead.
The focus, they say, lowering costs for everyday Americans. New data this week shows inflation cooling year over year, but a recent swing state voter survey shows on economic issues,
they say it's the most important subject.
Harris's Republican opponent, former President Donald Trump, still has an edge. 48% of respondents said they trust Trump more to get inflation and the cost of living under control, compared to 42% for Harris. Trump's lead is, however, shrinking compared to how he fared against President Biden on the same issue. Meanwhile, at a Trump campaign event in New Jersey last night,
we wouldn't have inflation. We wouldn't have had the Israeli attack.
The former president veered off script once again, from planned remarks on combating anti-Semitism to a controversial comment about Republican mega-donor Miriam Adelson. In 2018, Trump awarded Adelson the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Last night, he claimed that award was, quote, better than the highest decoration for members of the U.S. military.
It's actually much better because everyone gets the Congressional Medal of Honor. That's soldiers. They're either in very bad shape because they've been hit so many times by bullets, or they're dead.
A progressive Veterans Political Action Committee, Vote Vets, that's endorsed Harris, called Trump's remarks insulting, saying, quote, Donald Trump doesn't respect veterans and their sacrifice. But Trump's running mate, Ohio Senator and military veteran J.D. Vance, defended Trump at the Milwaukee Police Association today.
This is a guy who loves our veterans and who honors our veterans. I don't think him complimenting and saying a nice word about a person who received the Presidential Medal of Freedom is in any way denigrating those who received military honors.
It was Vance's second stop in Wisconsin this month after being named Trump's running mate at the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee in July. The Democratic National Convention will begin next week in neighboring Illinois, where Harris is expected to roll out additional detailed policy proposals. For more on the specifics of Harris's economic policy proposals, I'm joined by Gina Smilik, economics reporter for the New York Times. Gina, thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start with the Harris campaign's plan to address what they call price gouging here and what they blame in part for higher grocery prices. The Harris campaign says that she would implement the first ever federal ban on corporate price gouging and will work with the FTC and Congress to do so. So, Gina, what exactly are they proposing that they would do on this front? And knowing what you do about why grocery prices are where they are, could this approach actually work to bring those prices down?
So what exactly is kind of the key question here? And the answer is we don't know yet. We do not know exactly what this policy would look like. And I think the devil is really in the details. We do not know how they go about preventing price gouging or even how they're defining price gouging at this point. What we do know is that profits went up quite a lot in the grocery sector during the sort of aftermath of the 2020 pandemic. So in 2021, we saw profits shoot up at grocery stores, and they stayed up for a while. That was pretty consistent with what we saw across the economy. We really saw a lot of companies raking in a lot more profits because they were charging more. As costs had started to shoot up, they were charging more to try and cover those costs, and they actually even charged a bit more than was just necessary to cover costs during that period. And so there are a lot of people out there, a lot of economists, particularly on the progressive side of the aisle, who have been saying things like, this was an example of price gouging, this was an example of what happens when you have an imperfectly competitive marketplace, and really saying that we need to see some sort of response from the government on this. And that is what we're potentially seeing here. Now, you'll get economists on the other side saying that, this was an economy that basically worked the way you would expect. We had shortages for things. We had shortages for eggs. We had shortages for a lot of grain type things during this period. And as a result, companies were charging more because things were in short supply, and they could charge more. And that resulted in more production, and then prices came down. And so some economists are saying this is Econ 101. This is how things work. If you put some sort of price mechanism, or you do it's in some way stop the economy working from working the way that it just would on its own, you might not have that supply come online. And at the same time, progressive economists are really celebrating this. So you've got a very, very contentious debate without a lot of detail.
The devil, as you say, is in those details. So let's move on to housing then. We know is another big piece of this policy proposal. And on addressing the housing shortage and affordability problem in America, this is what the Harris campaign says they will do. They say that a potential President Harris would call for the construction of 3 million new housing units over the next 4 years. Also that the government would provide first-time home buyers with up to $25,000 in down payment assistance. Gina, from the experts you talked to who've looked at these plans, how viable are plans like this for that kind of level of building, and what's their potential impact?
Yeah, so I think there are two big questions here. One is political viability, and then second is economic viability. So when it comes to the political viability side, this stuff would have to pass Congress. In order to get those 3 million new homes built, you would really have to have a lot of the way the Harris campaign is proposing to do it is through a lot of incentives for home builders and for local housing authorities to really sort of encourage home building. And that money needs to come from Congress. So I think there's a real question, could you get it through? What does Congress look like? Is this going to be possible? Then on the backside of that, you've got to say, would it work? And would it work in the time frame that the Harris campaign is talking about? Because it's a pretty ambitious, pretty accelerated time frame they're laying out here. She's saying those 3 million units will go up within the 4 years that the first 4 years that she's in office. And so I think that, those are some big questions. And then the flip side here is if you're not building enough supply and you're giving first-time home buyers $25,000 as a credit, is there a risk that just all goes to prices? Is there a risk that home sellers can just charge more because now home buyers can afford to pay more? And so I think this is a big knotty set of questions that will really depend on sort of the political and practical realities of the moment.
Well, another set of proposals that would also have to go through Congress has to do with the child tax credit. On that, the Harris campaign says that she would propose not only restoring the child tax credit that was first introduced during the pandemic of $3,000 per child under the age of 18, up to $3,600 per child under the age of 6, but expanding the provision to $6,000 per child under the age of 1 for middle and low income families. So what's the viability for a plan like that, and what kind of a difference could that make?
Yeah, so this is a fascinating one because there really is a lot of bipartisan support for the child tax credit. In fact, we actually saw J.D. Vance over the weekend talking about how he'd love to see a bigger child tax credit. And so I think that there is some possibility that Republicans would reach across the aisle on this one, that you could get something through Congress on the child tax credit. I think the huge question, though, is how do you pay for it? It obviously is expensive to do these things. The Harris campaign hasn't laid out in detail how they're planning on paying for these kinds of policies. They do mention in their campaign briefings things like, making corporations and wealthy Americans pay their fair share. But at this point, we don't have any sort of detailed explanation of how these policies would be offset in the budget. And so I think that's the big question here going forward.
So, Gina, briefly, if you can, when you look big picture at these policy proposals, how do they compare to some of the proposals and the policies we've seen from the Biden administration? Is this the Harris campaign going in a new and different direction, or more of the same?
Yeah, so I think a lot of this actually really builds on sort of the Biden agenda, but then takes it just a step further and makes it a little bit more dramatic, maybe a little bit more populist in some cases, like the price gouging proposal, and certainly tries to really tackle a lot of kitchen table issues surrounding costs and price increases that have really just bedeviled the Biden-Harris White House. These have been real issues that they've struggled to sort of connect with voters on, and it seems like she's tackling them pretty head on here.
That is Gina Smialek, economics reporter for the New York Times. Gina, thank you so much. Good to speak with you.
Thanks for having me.
Turning our focus now to the Middle East, where mediators working toward a Gaza ceasefire wrapped up a second day of talks and by some indications ended on a hopeful note. Nick Schifrin joins us with more. Nick, it's good to see you. So where do these talks stand right now?
As you said, Jeff, U.S. officials are hopeful, even optimistic. A senior administration official who briefed reporters this afternoon used phrases like this, quote, "This process is now in the end game, a deal that is ready to be closed. The package is basically there." But crucially, there is still no Israeli and Hamas agreement, to new language that U.S., Qatari, and Egyptian mediators today called a bridging proposal. Now, recall that there is an overall agreement on the framework of the first phase of this deal, 6-week ceasefire, the release of more than 30 hostages from Hamas, and 700 Palestinian detainees released by Israel, and a humanitarian aid surge alongside a phased Israeli withdrawal from Gaza. But there are disagreements, and the new language is designed to bridge these disputes. So, number one, the senior official said on Israel's insistence to control the Philadelphia corridor between Gaza and Egypt, quote, "That issue is moving the right way." Number two, on checkpoints inside Gaza that Israel insists on, the official said the agreement aimed to block Gazans who might move from the south to the north with weapons. And number three, in the coming days, working groups will examine which Israeli hostages and Palestinian prisoners will be released and in what sequence. U.S., Egypt, and Qatar said today that they will aim to, quote, conclude the deal next week in Cairo. When they reconvene, President Biden said we're closer than we've ever been. But again, there's no confirmation from Israel or Hamas, the two sides fighting this war, that they will agree to language that the U.S. hopes not only pauses the war, but also blocks an Iranian attack on Israel.
Well, what do officials say about the possibility of such an attack?
They are still very worried about that because they have seen Iran make preparations for that attack. President Biden explicitly said tonight no one in the region, i.e. Iran, should launch an attack that could derail the negotiations. So if holding out hope for a Gaza ceasefire, if you will, is the kind of carrot to Iran, the administration also delivered a stick, an explicit warning to Iran. The senior administration official said of Iran's warning that it might strike Israel, he said, quote, "We would also encourage the Iranians, and I know many are, not to move down that road because the consequences could be quite cataclysmic, particularly for Iran." That is not language that this administration often uses. Tomorrow night, Secretary of State Tony Blinken, you see him there on a previous trip to Israel, will travel to Israel again to meet Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, a visit designed to underscore that U.S. message on Iran, but also, crucially, Jeff, try to make sure that Netanyahu agrees to the ceasefire language that is coming out today, because again, that other administration official warned Israel today, quote, "If you continue to negotiate for months and months and try and get the perfect deal, you risk having no hostages left to save."
All right, Nick Schifrin, thanks as always. Appreciate it. We start the day's other news with the war in Ukraine. After a week of headlines about Ukraine's incursion into Russia, now it's Russia which is looking to score a major military victory. Authorities in the eastern Ukrainian city of Pokrovsk have urged residents there to evacuate as Russian troops draw near. The city is one of Ukraine's main defensive strongholds and a key logistics hub in the Donetsk region. Meantime, Ukraine's army chief told President Volodymyr Zelensky via video call today that his forces are advancing a little over a mile into Russian territory. Ukraine says it now controls more than 440 square miles of Russia's Kursk region. Thousands of people protested in cities across India today amid growing national anger after a trainee doctor was raped and killed at a government hospital last week.
We want justice! We want justice! We want justice!
At one rally in New Delhi, medical workers in their white coats joined protesters to call for accountability. The protests started a week ago when police found the bloodied body of the 31-year-old at a medical college in Kolkata. An autopsy later confirmed that she had been sexually assaulted.
Women of this country are being wronged daily. Whether you are a rich or a poor woman, educated or uneducated woman, everyone's fate is the same. Predators can do anything they want to women in this country. There is no justice. There is no action.
The Indian Medical Association has called for a 24-hour withdrawal of services in protest starting Saturday, though they say essential services will still be provided. Final hurricane preparations are underway in Bermuda as Ernesto churns closer to its coastlines. The Category 2 storm is strengthening as it moves up the Atlantic, packing maximum sustained winds of 100 miles per hour. Ernesto could drop a foot of rain on the British territory starting Saturday morning. Meantime, in Puerto Rico, power has yet to be restored to some 250,000 people, nearly 3 days after the storm made landfall there. Another 170,000 are without water. The outages in Puerto Rico have prompted health and safety concerns for the island, where more than 40% of the population lives below the poverty line. A jury in Florida has convicted a white woman in the fatal shooting of a black neighbor over a dispute related to children playing near her home. The all-white jury found 60-year-old Susan Lawrence guilty of manslaughter after 2.5 hours of deliberation. Lawrence had claimed self-defense when she fired a single shot through her front door in June of last year, killing 35-year-old Ajika A.J. Owens. She faces up to 30 years in prison. President Biden designated the site of an infamous 1908 race riot in Illinois as a national monument today. Mr. Biden was joined by lawmakers and civil rights leaders in the Oval Office as he signed the proclamation making the site federal land. The monument covers more than 1.5 acres and serves as a reminder of the 2-day riot by white mobs that resulted in the deaths of several black residents and destroyed dozens of homes and businesses. At the White House today, President Biden said it's important to remember such history and that it doesn't fade away.
People want to erase history, to literally erase history. We're allowing history to be written what happened. So our children, our grandchildren, everybody understands what happened and what could still happen.
One notable fallout from the 1908 Springfield riots is that the tragedy helped lead to the creation of the NAACP. New Jersey Governor Phil Murphy picked his former chief of staff today to replace Senator Bob Menendez, who plans to resign later this month following his federal bribery conviction. At a press conference in Newark today, Governor Murphy said George Helmy will serve in the Senate until shortly after the November election. Once a winner is certified, Murphy will appoint that person to fill the role until the new Senate is sworn in early next year. Democratic Congressman Andy Kim is running against Republican real estate developer Curtis Beshaw to fill the seat left by Menendez. On Wall Street today, stocks closed out their best week of the year with some modest gains. The Dow Jones Industrial Average added nearly 100 points as recent economic data calmed investors' nerves. The Nasdaq tacked on 37 points to close out the week. The S&P 500 extended its winning streak to a 7th straight session. And we at PBS NewsHour are saddened to report that former NPR chief executive John Lansing has died just months after leaving the job. In his 4.5 years at the helm, Lansing saw NPR through the COVID pandemic, staff layoffs, and a financial crisis that he himself described as existential. Before that, Lansing enjoyed a long career in broadcasting and cable television. John Lansing was 67 years old. Still to come on the NewsHour, how the city hosting next week's Democratic National Convention has been handling a migrant surge. David Brooks and Jonathan Capehart break down the week's news. And former U.S. Ambassador John Sullivan discusses his new book about what led up to Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
This is the PBS NewsHour from WETA Studios in Washington and in the West from the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism at Arizona State University.
Chicago, the city hosting the Democratic National Convention next week, has been at the center of the national conversation on U.S. immigration policy. Laura Barone-Lopez is there and has this report.
All of us is to be human, is to face adversity in our lives.
Concord Missionary Baptist Church on Chicago's South Side has transformed in the last 2 years. The historically black church now offers live translation during its services to accommodate a growing number of Spanish-speaking congregants who fled their homes for the United States. Kenneth Phelps is the church's pastor.
They're here, they're hungry, and they're hurting, and they're in our community. And, you know, from a Christian standpoint, we've always welcomed the visitors and strangers.
People like Balexi Lugo, who are strangers no more. She now lives in a studio apartment with her 2 daughters after spending 6 months in a city-run shelter when they arrived from Venezuela.
It's good to feel that you have peace, and Pastor Phelps has helped me a lot with that. Any problem that we have or anything we need, he always tells us to let him know, and that he'll take care of us. I feel at home.
But the integration of these new members has not been easy.
Many of the community weren't welcoming.
Phelps says community outrage erupted early last year when the city opened a shelter for migrants at a defunct elementary school around the corner from the church. The community had been told that it would be a job training center.
We were told that, you know, the city didn't have resources to do that. And then somehow, mysteriously, magically, you find monies to open up a shelter. It just didn't set right with the community.
Over the last 2 years, Chicago has spent nearly $500 million on aiding migrants. It's one of several Democratic-led cities targeted by Texas Governor Greg Abbott, who has bused more than 100,000 migrants in a politically motivated move to shift the nation's attention to immigration.
I took the border to them, and those buses will continue to roll until we finally secure our border.
At its peak in January, Chicago housed 15,000 migrants. Today, the number is roughly 5,000. A drop that has coincided with a massive decline in the number of people apprehended crossing the southern border, due in part to a Biden administration action currently blocking asylum seekers.
So there are no people to put on buses to Chicago in mass numbers that we're aware of.
Beatriz Ponce de Leon, Chicago's deputy mayor for immigrant, migrant, and refugee rights, says the city is looking for more action from Washington.
This is a federal responsibility. What we have done here is build an asylum seeker resettlement program. It has been tense at times, but we have managed to do it without taking away from any programs or any other communities.
Like his 2020 and 2016 campaigns, Trump has increasingly demonized migrants.
They're poisoning the blood of our country. That's what they've done. They poison mental institutions and prisons all over the world.
Earlier this week, repeating his 2020 message that migrants were destroying American suburbs, Trump's campaign posted a meme on social media saying, "Import the third world, become the third world." But he's also using the influx of migrants in blue cities over the last 2 years to win over some black voters at the margins.
I will tell you that coming from the border are millions and millions of people that happen to be taking black jobs.
Again, perception is reality when it comes to politics.
Jaime Dominguez is a professor at Northwestern University. He says the large numbers of migrants sent to Chicago and other cities ignited a broader discussion among Democrats.
It did at least force the Democratic Party to begin to have a conversation, right, about going forward, what kind of platform that we're going to put forward when it came to immigration.
As a border state prosecutor, she took on drug cartels.
In recent weeks, the Harris campaign began running ads in Arizona and Nevada that lean into her background as Attorney General of California and includes a pledge to hire thousands more Border Patrol agents. In rallies, Vice President Kamala Harris has attacked Republicans for killing a border security bill, one of the most conservative to be considered by Congress in decades.
Earlier this year, we had a chance to pass the toughest bipartisan border security bill in decades. But Donald Trump tanked the deal.
Despite polls showing Harris ahead or gaining momentum in nearly all battleground states, a recent PBS News NPR Marist poll found registered voters favor Trump on handling immigration, 53% compared to 47% for Harris. The former president has made the deportation of undocumented immigrants a central tenet of his campaign's immigration proposals.
We are going to start the largest mass deportation in the history of our country because we have no choice.
That worries 24-year-old Estefania Riera, who arrived in Chicago 4 months ago with her partner and her 2 children.
We feel very hurt. We understand the damage they will do to us. There may be some people who come to do harm, but we are not all the same. In Venezuela, my 13-year-old brother was killed, so I fled to the United States. We just want to work, to look for a better life here for our children and for ourselves.
Riera is a client at Onward House on the city's northwest side, a nonprofit supporting asylum seekers in Chicago. Despite fewer people arriving in recent months, caseworker Johnny Barrera says the organization is still scrambling to provide services.
We actually have more than 1,000 on the waiting list, so it's a very high need.
Barrera says many clients here are aware that their ability to make a life in the U.S. may be upended if former President Trump wins in November.
They're very well informed on what's going on. And so having to come into this country during the elections and now having to run the risk of being deported, the clients are very afraid.
Here in Chicago, the promised influx of migrants from Texas to coincide with the Democratic National Convention hasn't materialized. And today, U.S. Customs and Border Protection announced that encounters were down 32% from June to July, the lowest monthly total since September of 2020. And that's the first full month of data since President Biden signed an executive action restricting asylum seekers. Jeff?
Laura Barone Lopez, thank you. Just days before she formally accepts her party's nomination at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, Vice President Kamala Harris is unveiling key policy proposals. For that and more, we turn to the analysis tonight of Brooks and Capehart. That's New York Times columnist David Brooks and Jonathan Capehart, associate editor for The Washington Post. It's great to see you both. So, Jonathan, Kamala Harris, as we mentioned, she's hoping to sharpen her economic message with a focus on cutting costs. Your paper, The Washington Post, referred to it as an aggressively populist economic agenda. She's talking about eliminating medical debt for millions of Americans, a cap on prescription drug costs, a $25,000 subsidy for first-time home buyers. Give us some of your top takeaways from the speech and her policy rollout.
Well, clearly, as we know from the polls, that the economy is either issue number 1, 2, or 3 for the American people. So it makes sense that she would use her first policy speech to focus on not just economics and just a piece of economics, because she did say at the top of her remarks that there are a bunch of other things that she's going to roll out later, but she wanted to focus on this very narrow issue, which are issues that the American people say is top of mind for them: cost of living and everything that relates to that, whether it's drug prices or rents or grocery prices. And so, you know, whether she will be able to fulfill a lot of these promises, that remains to be seen. A lot of it also has to do with the makeup of the next Congress. But the thing that is top of mind for me is that not only is she using prices and consumer prices and what the American voters are thinking of, where the economy hits them hardest in the pocketbook. This comes after the Financial Times, University of Michigan Ross School of Business put out a poll, I think it was on Saturday or Sunday, just over the weekend, that showed that the vice president is 1 point higher, 42% to 41% for Donald Trump, in terms of how the people surveyed who they trust to guide the economy. And that's no matter who they wanted to vote for. And so the momentum that we have seen the vice president have at her back since taking over the top of the ticket is now, you know, she's got the momentum at her back when it comes to policy issues and on the economy in particular.
And David, on this matter of economic policy, the vice president is also proposing the first ever ban on price gouging for groceries. This is something I know you took particular issue with. It polls well with swing voters, but economists say the underlying reasons why prices are higher, it's a more complicated argument.
Yeah, I mean, she has some good policies in this package. I think the child tax credit is a good thing. She wants to deregulate housing so we can get more homes. But the price gouging is just, well, Catherine Rampell, the Washington Post columnist and NewsHour contributor, said it's impossible to exaggerate how bad this policy is. And I agree with that. And Catherine had a good line that if your opponent is calling you a communist, maybe don't lead with price controls. And so price controls just create shortages, they create black markets. We've seen it happen in Venezuela, we've seen it happen in the Soviet Union. Price controls just don't work. What's worse about that, first, it's trying to address a problem that does not exist. Grocery prices, inflation has been less than 1% for the past year. It's over. We had a surge, but it's over. The problem does not exist. But the real core problem is it expresses a level of economic illiteracy, which is kind of surprising in a responsible Democratic candidate. You know, the idea behind greedflation is that we had all these years of low inflation under Obama and under Bush's, and I guess people weren't greedy then. And then Biden gets in, and suddenly, magically, they all get greedy and start price gouging. And they do it at Kroger's, at Harris Teeter, at H-E-B. Suddenly, there's this mass of price gouging, and she thinks she can prosecute it. That's not why inflation surged. Inflation surged because we had a pandemic, which screwed up supply chains and productivity. Then the Biden administration overstimulated the economy, too many dollars chasing too few goods. Obama administration officials Larry Summer and Jason Furman said at the time, this is going to cause inflation. Lo and behold, it did. The Fed has to clamp down on growth, raising everybody's interest payments. That's what caused inflation. That's solid, basic economics. Her greedflation plan is somewhere off, outside of normal economics.
What about that, Jonathan? That the Harris policy, parts of it at least, speak to an economic illiteracy?
Well, I mean, I take issue with the use of the word illiteracy. But, you know, we'll just have to agree to disagree on our word choices, David. But, you know, Catherine Rampell raises a very good point. And her column I found to be rather persuasive. And so now it's incumbent upon the vice president and her team to flesh this out a little bit more. But if we're going to talk about economic illiteracy, can we talk about Donald Trump in his proposal that he talked about at his press conference, I believe it was last night, talking about a tariff on all imports. And we don't talk enough about what that tariff on all imports would mean to the American consumer. And that would mean higher prices. But the former president doesn't talk about that. So I think, you know, when you're talking about the vice president's plan on price gouging and whether she'd be able to get that done, or we talk about the former president's plan for tariffs on all imports, let's have this robust conversation, which I think we will have because the vice president still has to flesh out other pieces of her economic agenda.
Well, let's keep our focus on Donald Trump for a moment because he is facing backlash over his comments about veterans. Here's what he said at an event at his Bedminster estate over the weekend.
I watched Sheldon sitting so proud in the White House when we gave Miriam the Presidential Medal of Freedom. That's the highest award you can get as a civilian. It's the equivalent of the Congressional Medal of Honor, but civilian version. It's actually much better because everyone gets the Congressional Medal of Honor. That's soldiers. They're either in very bad shape because they've been hit so many times by bullets or they're dead. She gets it, and she's a healthy, beautiful woman. It's right. And they're rated equal.
What should we make of these comments from last night?
You know, when I covered the McCain campaign, he had a whole group of Medal of Honor winners. And they were not bullet-ridden. They were great guys. I was in awe to be around those guys. People who win the Medal of Honor, they've done something really awesome and something amazing. But throughout his career, Donald Trump has had trouble with military valor. He attacked McCain on it. He's attacked the people who were in the cemeteries in France. He's attacked them here because that's what real manhood looks like. And it bugs him. And so this is just a piece of that emotional weakness in Donald Trump's character.
And Jonathan, there are Republicans who've pointed out that at a time when you have the Republican campaign targeting Walz's military record, this gives the Harris campaign fodder for a counterattack now aimed at Donald Trump.
Absolutely. I mean, what did Mrs. Adelson do? that was in service to something other than herself. I mean, the people who get these medals, particularly the members of the military who the former president disparaged, gave something. Either they gave their lives, or they gave their limbs, or they gave their mental health. They gave a lot for this in service of this country. It is like these are the biggest patriots there are. And I agree with David. This is just, I wouldn't say he's got some little deep. I think Donald Trump is broken. He is broken when it comes to anything related to, I don't know, human feelings, something where someone does something for someone other than themselves. And I don't know, it's too late for him to fix it, but it's not too late for the American people to ensure that he's never put in a position to give another Presidential Medal of Freedom again.
And again, from a political standpoint, is there a risk that voters grow tired of what is now a very familiar act? I raise the question because Megyn Kelly, the former Fox personality who now has a podcast, I think, still influential in conservative circles, said that Trump's rambling, that's the word that she used, rambling is boring, and she says it's probably age-related.
Yeah, I wonder about that. I mean, Trump has been saying stupid stuff for a long time. And frankly, for all of Kamala Harris's rise, which is real, like it's been fantastic, the rise she's had from her perspective. But Trump is still doing better than he was than in 2020 or 2016. So he's still a very viable candidate. And all the stupid comments, which now run into the zillions, don't seem to have hurt him because people basically think he gets them. And you can tell a lot of lies, but if people think they get you and they recognize the story you tell about America, they will support you nonetheless. So he may be getting older. I certainly, watching the rallies, I think he's less funny than he was. Certainly, just as an entertainer, he's less of an entertainer. So I think Megyn Kelly is definitely onto something. But so far, I don't see big political deficits for him on that front.
Jonathan, what about that? Because earlier you mentioned Kamala Harris's momentum. Does the energy and enthusiasm on the Democratic side, does it mask the fact that this is still a competitive race? I think the Cook Political Report has her up by less than 1 point right now, heading into the convention.
Right. Yeah, I mean, this race has always been statistically tied. But you can't deny that you would rather be the Democratic ticket right now with momentum and enthusiasm at your side and pushing you into your convention and hopefully pushing you out of your convention, even if you're statistically tied. But, you know, Donald Trump, this is probably the one and only time I will agree with Megyn Kelly. His shtick, it is not funny. It is boring. It's tiresome. And even if there are people who support the former president, even those who are on the periphery, which are those are the folks he's got to worry about, those Republicans or those folks who might think that, you know, I don't know if I want to vote for this guy again. I don't know if I want to go through another 4 years of vengeance and name calling and tearing this country down. Yeah, I've watched just about every rally and speech and press conference he's done since the change at the top of the Democratic ticket. And it's like watching an old cover band just play the same old, what they view as their hits over and over again. At a certain point, Donald Trump is going to have to give not just his supporters, his diehard followers something. He's got to give other people a reason to vote for him. And so far, maybe I'm biased, but I don't see it.
Well, next week it'll be Democrats' turn to cheerlead their presidential nominee, Kamala Harris, and her new running mate, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz. What will you be watching for, Jonathan? What do you want to hear?
Well, a few things. One, I'll be watching to see how the Democratic Party treats President Biden on his big night on Monday. The other thing I'll be looking for is, you know, whether the protests related to Gaza, whether they make their way inside the hall, and if they make their way inside the hall, how big they will be, how disruptive they will be, and what the reaction will be. And then, you know, the vice president's speech, the vice presidential nominee's speech, and then the presidential nominee's speech, and what they say, how they say it, and how they rock it or don't rock it out of Chicago.
It is a little confusing when you have a vice president who's the presidential nominee and a vice presidential candidate all in the same party. What are you going to be watching for?
Yeah, well, this is the first year where I've gone to 2 happy conventions in my life, because usually one party knows they're down, but when the Republicans had theirs, they thought we're winning, and now the Democrats are in a fantastic mood. I'll be watching for the Biden speech, all the big names, the Obamas, but mostly I'm looking for whether the country is ready for an emotional change of tone, from anger and pessimism, which has been the tone of American politics, to something exuberant and joyful, which is what Harris has been offering.
Yeah. Her approach and her use of the word joy and Tim Walz's approach too, why do you think that might be effective in this cycle?
Yeah, I watched the Montana rally that Trump did this week, and she was out in Nevada, and I just turned off the volume on YouTube, and just look at her face. She's talking about prosecuting people, but she's exuberant. She's just sending out waves of positive emotion. And Trump, even when he's talking about how much people love him, he looks scowling and resentful and angry. And we've been in a very pessimistic mode, and maybe the country's still there. That's still a possibility. I was just out in the Rocky Mountain region. I met a lot of people who are in a very pessimistic mood about this country. But maybe there's been a shift toward a more a politics of joy, if you want to call it that.
All right, David Brooks and Jonathan Capehart, we will see you both in Chicago.
See you.
Thanks, Jack.
Visitors to a new art installation in the Caribbean will need to take masks and oxygen tanks. Called A World Adrift, the underwater sculptural exhibition is the work of a British artist who wants to highlight the dangers of climate change for the West Indies. Special correspondent Malcolm Brabant reports for our ongoing coverage of the intersection of art and climate change and our series Canvas.
In common with every artist, Jason DeCaires Taylor's vision begins with a blank canvas. But his latest is more exotic than most, the shallows of the Caribbean.
For me, it's really important. It's a way of telling stories about the sea, it's about a relationship to nature, and looking into this fascinating space where colours are different, refraction is different, textures, formations, evolution, even how you feel is completely different.
Taylor's Cavernous studio in the county of Kent, southeast of London, is currently empty. The sculptures and the message they convey are being installed on the sea floor. What's left behind are his preparatory models.
This is trying to get an idea of what the larger pieces are going to look like once they're underwater. So we try to replicate the water, the surface texture, how light will penetrate through that, and how again the organic transformation will adhere to the figures and change how they look.
This is where you'll be able to find the installation, nestling in the turquoise waters of Carriacou, one of 3 islands that comprise the small nation of Grenada. Paradise in peril.
They're small boats. They're made to look like they're fabricated in origami. They're actually made in marine stainless steel, and they encompass these local school children. And they have sails which also sort of depict messages about climate change. But overall, it's meant to sort of show this fragile future that we're building for our young communities, and how in peril they are.
Climate change is a constant theme of Taylor's work. In sight of Britain's Parliament, these 4 horsemen of the apocalypse are speaking to power, sending a message to governments everywhere: reverse the pace of climate change and stop the waters rising. Not far from Taylor's studio in Whitstable, on the North Kent coast, is the sculptor's expression of anger at pollution exacerbated by climate change. This work, sitting on the shingle, is in solidarity with wild swimmers and fisherfolk whose livelihood is dependent on some of Britain's finest oyster beds. Just like the Caribbean, wet old Britain is suffering from climate change in that it's raining even more than ever before. And when it rains, Britain's antiquated sewage systems just can't cope, and the water companies are pumping record levels of sewage into the rivers and the seas. How can art affect climate change?
I'm not sure how it can affect climate change, but it can certainly change our attitudes towards it. And so with this particular installation, I'm really hoping that it will demonstrate how fragile some of these small Caribbean nation islands are, and how at risk they are from hurricanes, rising sea levels, warming seas, which have a very detrimental effect to the coral reefs.
And the warm seas also have a really serious effect on making the hurricanes stronger.
Yes, of course, the hurricanes become much stronger, and they become earlier in the season. This recent Hurricane Beryl, is the first time that a Category 5 hurricane has ever been recorded at this time of year.
Hurricane Beryl, which struck at the beginning of July, caused devastation in Grenada. 3 people were killed. 70% of buildings on Carriacou, the site of Taylor's newest work, were either damaged or destroyed. It's because of such natural disasters and the fear of worse to come that the government of Grenada commissioned the sculptor. What is the purpose of doing sculptures underwater where relatively few people can see them?
So there are many different purposes. You know, I think first and foremost, on a very basic level, they're a habitat for marine life. So they're designed with textures, formations, surfaces that actually attract marine life. And so that then becomes a platform for corals, for crustaceans, for different types of creatures to actually live within. It also helps draw people away from natural settings. So the visitors that go to different regions, it helps take them away from natural sites and then brings them to these artificial areas.
But who's going to see it apart from snorkelers?
Well, you'd be surprised. Obviously, you know, now we're in a very digital era, so, you know, thousands of people see it via their screens.
We're never going to engineer or negotiate ourselves out of this ecological crisis. That's only part of the solution. For me, it's about changing our values and belief systems. But watching nature reclaim its space gives me a sense of hope and a real sense of healing. If we can reconsider our relationship to nature, to revere it, be reminded that we are nature ourselves, we might see who we really are and what an incredible world we're really part of.
And the coming few months could underscore the relevance of Taylor's work. Climate experts are predicting that this hurricane season will be particularly severe. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Malcolm Brabant in Kent.
Sudan has been caught in a bloody war between the country's army and a militia, the Rapid Support Forces, for 16 months, with tens of millions of Sudanese civilians caught in between. This week, the United States mediated peace talks in Geneva. The RSF militia sent a delegation, but at the last minute appeared to not officially participate in the talks. The Sudanese armed forces refused to attend altogether. In the first of her reports from a rare trip inside the country with the support of the Pulitzer Center, special correspondent Layla Molana Allen sat down with Sudan's vice president in Port Sudan on the Red Sea.
5 years ago, elated Sudanese, young and old, danced in the streets after countrywide protests brought down Sudan's 30-year dictator and indicted war criminal Omar al-Bashir. Democracy had arrived. But just 2 years later, the Sudanese army and a rehabilitated militia, the Rapid Support Forces, united under Army Chief Abdel Fattah al-Burhan and took power in what Sudanese civil society calls a coup against the people. Malik Agar is Sudan's vice president and deputy head of the military junta that's ruled the country since 2021. A former insurgent leader, he's been a leading political and military figure for decades. Before the explosion of the conflict last April, RSF leader General Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, widely known as Hemedti, was vice president. Agar succeeded him after the RSF broke away from Sudan's army and began to fight against it. The war erupted seemingly without warning, taking most Sudanese by surprise in its speed and ferocity. The NewsHour sat down with Vice President Agar to discuss the latest on the fighting and the prospects for peace.
The attacking force was a collateral force, very huge, and they put the Sudan government army into a position of defense. And after 1 year, the Sudanese army managed to change the mood of the war, and now the Sudanese army is on offense. So to fight them, to follow them from area to area, is rather difficult for a conventional army. This is why it's taking long.
Agar has been an outspoken critic of international attempts to mediate the conflict and encourage negotiations with the RSF, saying the only solution is the complete military destruction of the militia.
Any leader in Sudan who can go into negotiations with the RSF is committing a political suicide. RSF is an instrument, is a tool for the UAE and others. Hemeti has no control of the forces here. How do you kill people? How do you rape girls and women and everybody and destroy the infrastructure and you want to rule? Then you have no control of these forces.
Multiple foreign governments, including the United Arab Emirates, Russia, Saudi Arabia and Iran, have taken an interest in the conflict, resulting in a steady flow of foreign weapons and mercenaries on both sides. In June, Agar travelled to Russia to meet with President Vladimir Putin. We asked what he hoped to achieve.
Because I'm fighting a war, and when I'm fighting a war, I don't need pens, I need weapons. And who manufactures weapons? And if I have the ability of getting those weapons, if I have the means of getting this one, I will get it.
Attention to the conflict has been muted in the West, but news that Sudan's government had repaired diplomatic relations with Iran and signed a new weapons deal this spring raised alarm. Agar says if the United States is worried about where they get their weapons, it should sell to Sudan itself.
We are not saying here, I'm not confessing here we are buying weapons from Iran, but we are ready to buy weapons from any country.
Human rights groups have documented evidence of weapons being supplied to the RSF by the UAE, Russia and Turkey, among others, smuggled into RSF territory via neighbouring Chad. The United States is a leading arms seller to the UAE.
What impact are those foreign weapons having on your ability to fight this war?
Definitely, they have an effect, a great effect, because these are new weapons. They are not used. Sudanese army they never had such weapons. These militia are being supported by the UAE. I mean, let me put it bluntly, by the UAE and others. The UAE has a lot of economical interests in Sudan. Number one of them is gold mining in Sudan. They wanted some sort of agricultural lands in Sudan. They had also an interest of having an area on the Red Sea for their own interests. We believe there is other interests from other countries also. So it is a complex situation.
What do you want the United States to do in terms of taking responsibility for the use of those US-manufactured weapons being used to slaughter innocent civilians here in Sudan?
One thing that the US government can do is, one, to stop supplying the EUA. They know, the Americans, they know that weapons are being used in Sudan. There is no doubt about that because the evidence are there. So then, for them also, they have to decide what do they want the war in Sudan to continue, or do they want, as they talk about democracy and human rights, do they want to preserve the human rights of the Sudanese? And you cannot bring democracy on the middle of the guns. And you cannot bring democracy when you are using militias.
So you believe that these efforts on behalf of the United States to try and become involved in peace talks for Sudan are simply political posturing ahead of the election?
Yes, yes, definitely yes. They are just political alibi and they are not serious about it. When these elections are over, they will change their mind.
The US is mediating talks this week in Geneva aimed at improving the humanitarian situation. But both of the chief parties to the conflict are absent. Leaders say they have little faith in the process.
What is it that makes you feel that this US administration isn't a serious partner for peace in Sudan?
Their behavior tells me that. The US administration, they have never came here. We have an envoy who has never put a leg in Sudan. And he's a special envoy for Sudan. And he's just talking with others that from Egypt and Uganda, Kenya, and all these things. And you just bypass Sudan in the middle here.
US engagement has been patchy. Special Envoy to Sudan, Tom Perriello, has never visited the country in his role. A planned visit alongside USAID Director Samantha Power was aborted after the US team refused to travel any further inside Sudan than the airport, citing security concerns.
What does that say to you about their seriousness of being involved in peace talks with Sudan?
If you are serious to solve a problem somewhere, why you don't go and meet the president in his country? Why you don't meet us in our country? But this is it's not happening.
Meanwhile, civil political leaders say they've been cut out of the peace talks and plans for Sudan's future.
Is it the intention of the Sudanese armed forces to immediately give back power to a democratically elected leader when the war is over?
Yet they are ready to take the country to elections and hand over power.
And that is what will happen?
That is what's supposed to happen. You win the war first, and then you go for establishment of democracy.
For now, as the war rages on, democracy has been put on the back burner. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Layla Malana Allen in Port Sudan.
We had hoped to bring you an interview with former U.S. Ambassador to Russia, John Sullivan, about his new book, Midnight in Russia, but we experienced some technical difficulties, so we'll have that conversation for you next week.
Also next week, be sure to join us for special coverage of the Democratic National Convention. That begins on Monday at 8 p.m. Eastern.
And tonight, tune into Washington Week with The Atlantic for a preview of the convention and analysis of the presidential race.
And that is the NewsHour for tonight. I'm Amna Nawaz.
And I'm Jeff Bennett. Thanks for spending part of your evening with us, and have a great weekend.
Major funding for the PBS NewsHour has been provided by and with the ongoing support of these individuals and institutions, and friends of the NewsHour, including Kathy and Paul Anderson, and Camilla and George Smith. The Walton Family Foundation, working for solutions to protect water during climate change so people and nature can thrive together. The William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, for more than 50 years advancing ideas and supporting institutions to promote a better world, at hewlett.org. And with the ongoing support of these individuals and institutions. And friends of the NewsHour. This program was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
You're watching PBS.